In the sweltering summer of 1959 Naples, a single figure drew the eyes of a nation. Assunta Pupetta Maresca, draped in black and veiled in mourning, stepped into a courtroom, not as a beauty queen, but as a widow who had avenged her husband with bullets. To some, she was a murderer. To others, a woman of honor embodying the ancient codes of the South. In the charged air of the Palazzo di Giustizia, her trial became more than a legal battle. It was the birth of a legend. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. In Naples, 1959, the summer air hung heavy with cigarette smoke and the restless murmur of crowds pressing against the courthouse steps. The marble facade of the Palazzo di Giustizia shimmered in the August heat, flashes from journalists' cameras bouncing off its columns like bursts of gunfire. Inside, a drama unfolded that would grip Italy and reverberate across Europe. The trial of Assunta Pupetta Maresca, a 24-year-old widow accused of avenging her slain husband with her own pistol. To the men of the Camorra, her presence was extraordinary. To the watching public, it was myth in the making. She entered the chamber draped in a black veil, the fabric whispering with each step, her eyes fixed forward, unflinching. Even as the prosecutors recited the charge of murder, the spectators' attention fell not on the words, but on the figure of the accused, whose beauty and defiance seemed to challenge the very authority of the court. The clicking of typewriters from the press benches carried like a metronome through the proceedings, every keystroke shaping the legend that surrounded her. The courtroom smelled of sweat and ink, mingled with the faint scent of expensive perfume clinging to Pupetta's dress, a subtle reminder of her beauty queen past. Reporters compared her poise to an actress on screen, a woman who transformed tragedy into theatre. The Camorra has found its tragic heroine, wrote Il Mattino on July 23, 1959, a line that captured both admiration and dread. She sat between her attorneys with the dignity of a monarch, hands folded, the glint of a rosary slipping through her fingers. Behind her, rows of curious faces whispered tales of vendetta, recalling how her husband Pasquale Simonetti, known as Pasqualone Ainola, had been shot down in the fruit markets just months after their wedding. Honor had demanded blood, and she had supplied it with her own hand. When the prosecutor described her as a danger to the order of society, she turned her head sharply, veil swaying, and declared, "I did it, and I would do it again," her voice carrying across the chamber, recorded in the court transcript of that year. The statement electrified the room, both confession and manifesto, confirming what Naples already believed. Pupetta was no ordinary woman, and hers was no ordinary crime. Midway through the proceedings, the geography of the city pressed into the trial itself. From the open windows came the sound of trolley cars rattling down Via Monte Oliveto, a reminder that life outside continued while inside the court history was being written. The trial was not merely about a murder, it was about the tension between old codes of honor and the modernizing Italian state. In a city still scarred by post-war poverty, the Camorra thrived in black markets and extortion, and Pupetta's act seemed to many Neapolitans less a crime than a restoration of justice. A police official later reflected, "Her gunshot spoke louder than our laws." La Repubblica, 1965. A rare admission that the state's grip was fragile. Even as the judges deliberated, whispers of admiration spread through the women in the gallery, some nodding silently at her courage to avenge betrayal. At the heart of the trial stood a contradiction. Pupetta was both an emblem of feminine grace and a symbol of ruthless violence, a woman who had once worn satin sashes in beauty contests, now facing decades behind bars. Her defense attorneys leaned into this paradox, painting her as a victim of love and loyalty, not a predator of the streets. Journalists described her as a Madonna with a pistol, half saint, half assassin. The micro detail that lingered in observers' minds was her lace-gloved hand tightening around a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, a small gesture that seemed to embody both fragility and resolve. When asked about her motives, she allegedly told an investigator, "I was carrying his child. Could I let the killer breathe?" Naples Police Report, 1959. The line, whether precise or embellished, spread quickly in newspapers and taverns, fueling her transformation into legend. The verdict, though still weeks away, felt less important than the spectacle itself. Each day, as she left the chamber, photographers surged forward, the popping of flashbulbs lighting her face as though she were on a stage. The crowd outside pressed closer, some shouting insults, others blessings, their voices rising like chants of an ancient ritual. In those moments, Pupetta ceased to be merely a defendant. She became the embodiment of the South's code of vengeance, where a widow's tears were answered not with patience but with bullets. As she descended the courthouse steps beneath the Neapolitan sun, the echoes of shutters clicking seemed to merge with the echo of the shots she had fired years before. The trial that stunned Italy was more than a judgment of law. It was the unveiling of a myth. The veil she wore, black and impenetrable, framed not only her face, but also the paradox of her existence: beauty and blood, devotion and defiance. And as the cameras captured her silence, the city held its breath, knowing this was only the beginning of Pupetta Maresca's story. In Castellammare di Stabia, 1935, the cries of newborn Assunta Maresca echoed through a narrow alley where plaster crumbled from walls still bearing scars of old poverty. The smell of the sea mingled with coal smoke drifting from fishermen's huts, and in the distance, church bells marked the rhythm of life in a town both devout and desperate. From the start, her world was one of contradictions, beauty pressed against squalor, innocence woven into codes of silence. Her father, a small-time smuggler moving contraband cigarettes through the port, was not a powerful man, but he carried himself with the pride of one who understood the unwritten laws of the Camorra. To young Assunta, he was both protector and teacher, instilling the lessons of loyalty, discretion, and vengeance in a manner more binding than scripture. She grew up listening not to fairy tales, but to whispers of men betrayed, of debts paid in blood, of neighbors who had vanished after breaking their word. Even as a child, she carried herself with an unusual poise, a dignity that made neighbors remark years later. She walked like a queen, even as a girl. Corriere della Sera, 1984. The war came, and with it, the collapse of ordinary life. In Naples and its surrounding towns, Allied bombs tore through tenements, leaving behind rubble where children picked at twisted iron and mothers scavenged for bread. The black market became not just a refuge, but a lifeline, and the Camorra, though weakened under fascism, found its chance for resurgence in the chaos of post-war trade. Smuggling, once whispered about in corners, grew brazen in the open-air markets where the scent of roasted chestnuts and cheap tobacco filled the air. For Assunta, still only a girl, these streets were her classroom. She watched men slit open crates of American Lucky Strikes and barter them against loaves of bread or rationed sugar, the rough texture of burlap sacks brushing against her fingertips as she carried goods home for her father. It was a world where the uniform of the Carabinieri inspired not respect but avoidance, where survival depended on knowing who to trust and when to keep silent. By 1945, when the war ended, Naples was a city of ruins, but also of opportunity. On Via Foria, black marketeers sold everything from flour to stolen army boots, and the Camorra began stitching itself back into the city's bloodstream. For young Assunta, now entering her teenage years, beauty became both shield and weapon. Her almond-shaped eyes and proud carriage set her apart from other girls in the quarter, attracting attention she neither encouraged nor dismissed. She learned quickly that a glance could buy protection, that silence could secure favor, and that loyalty, especially to family, was worth more than money. A neighbor recalled in an interview decades later, even at 13, she would not lower her eyes. It was as though she dared the world to challenge her. La Stampa, 1975. That defiance would become the core of her character, but also the spark that pulled her deeper into the orbit of men who lived by the gun. Geographically, Castellammare di Stabia sat like a hinge between the glitter of Naples and the desolation of rural Campania, a port town where fishermen, smugglers, and Camorra foot soldiers rubbed shoulders. By the mid-1940s, the Nuova Camorra had not yet risen under Cutolo. Instead, fragmented clans battled for scraps of territory, each claiming a handful of markets or docks. Assunta's father belonged to no grand dynasty, but his dealings taught her that power often began in the smallest exchanges. She absorbed the lesson during one vivid childhood memory, a raid on the harbour where police seized contraband cigarettes. She watched her father's face harden as officers in grey uniforms loaded crates onto a truck, while men in the crowd muttered curses. What struck her most was not the loss of money, but the silence her father maintained, lips pressed tight, eyes burning with humiliation. In that silence she learned that words were dangerous, and that pride could be carried even in defeat. The city's cultural rhythms shaped her as much as its crimes. Neapolitan songs floated from radios perched in cafe windows. The scratchy voice of Roberto Morolo singing Monasterio e Santa Chiara in 1947, a ballad of ruin and longing that matched the city's broken skyline. At night, the sounds of American soldiers on leave drifted through the streets, jazz tunes from jukeboxes, shouts of dice games, the hiss of a freshly lit Chesterfield. Against this backdrop, Assunta walked with her chin lifted, her hair tied back in simple ribbons, her shoes often scuffed but worn like a queen's slippers. The micro detail remembered by locals was her habit of tucking a sprig of rosemary behind her ear, a gesture both innocent and strangely regal, as though claiming ownership of the street she walked. Law enforcement began to take notice of her family's dealings in the post-war years, though rarely with serious intervention. One Carabinieri officer later admitted in a 1960s interview, "We knew the Marescas trafficked in cigarettes, but in those days everyone did." Il Mattino, 1962. It was an era when the line between necessity and crime blurred, when poverty pushed ordinary families into illegal trades. For Assunta, however, the lesson was sharper. The law existed not as protector, but as adversary, and justice could be claimed only through one's own hands. This worldview, hardened in adolescence, would later explode into the act that made her infamous. By the late 1940s, as Italy staggered toward reconstruction, Assunta emerged as a young woman who embodied both the hardship and resilience of her city. She was not yet the avenger who would stand before judges in a black veil, but the foundation was already set. Friends remembered her laughter, quick and sharp, echoing down narrow alleys. Enemies recalled the way she could cut them down with a single glare. Her power status, even before adulthood, was undeniable. A girl from a poor smuggler's home whose beauty and willpower forced others to notice her. The seeds of destiny were planted in those bombed-out streets, watered by hunger, silence, and the smell of contraband smoke. And so, from the alleys of Castellamare di Stabia to the crumbling streets of post-war Naples, the daughter of the South grew into her legend. The sounds of trolley bells, the taste of roasted chestnuts, the smell of sea salt on humid evenings. All these imprinted upon her, as deeply as the codes of loyalty and vengeance whispered by her father. The child who once tucked rosemary behind her ear would one day carry a pistol in her purse, her footsteps echoing, not in playful alleys, but in crowded courtrooms. And in the memory of those who watched her youth unfold, she remained always the same, a girl who walked like a queen, even when surrounded by ruins. Naples, 1949, a city still clawing its way out of wartime ruin, pulsed with restless energy. And in the crowded piazzas, the sounds of mandolins mixed with the clatter of trams as a teenage Assunta Maresca stepped into the light of public attention. Local beauty contests, held in modest dance halls with walls yellowed by cigarette smoke, offered a brief escape for a people scarred by hunger and bombed-out streets. And it was here that Assunta dazzled. She wore dresses stitched by her mother from scraps of fabric, yet she carried herself with such regal poise that judges and spectators alike nicknamed her Pupetta, the little doll. The scent of cheap perfume hung in the air as applause followed her, and newspaper clippings described her not as fragile, but as commanding, a girl whose elegance concealed steel. Her triumphs were whispered about across Castellamare di Stabia, where old women selling roasted chestnuts nodded approvingly as she passed, and young men turned their heads in awe. But beneath the charm contests and stage lights, Naples was tightening under the grip of the Camorra, its clans rebuilding through black market produce, smuggled cigarettes, and extortion rackets. By the early 1950s, one name dominated this murky commerce: Pasquale Simonetti, known on the streets as Pasqualone e Nola, a towering figure who controlled the fruit markets with both cunning and violence. He noticed Pupetta not just for her beauty, but for the pride in her step, the same defiance he saw in himself. Their first meeting, remembered by those who knew them, took place in the bustle of Piazza Mercato, the air filled with the aroma of fresh citrus and the cries of vendors hawking their wares. Pasqualone, in a crisp suit despite the summer heat, offered her a smile that carried the weight of his reputation. According to a friend, he allegedly told her, "You are not like the others. You carry yourself like a queen." Testimony, Naples Court, 1959. That single recognition began a whirlwind romance that shocked and fascinated the city. By 1953, the pair became inseparable, Pupetta riding in his car through Via Toledo, while locals whispered at the sight of the beauty queen with the king of the markets. The streets echoed with period songs like Renato Carasone's Maruzella, blaring from jukeboxes in smoky bars where his men gathered, while Pupetta sat at his side, her presence softening his hard edges. Yet she was not blind to what lay beneath the glamour. Pascalone's hands bore calluses not from labor, but from decades of street fights and the weight of pistols, and his bodyguards, always within reach, smoked Nazionali cigarettes, their eyes scanning for rivals. At a dinner on the Amalfi coast, Pupetta's cousin recalled, she refused to lower her eyes when one of Pascalone's men warned her about the dangers of his world. If danger is his life, then it will be mine too, she allegedly replied. Il Mattino, 1955. This declaration captured her contradiction. She was drawn not despite the violence, but because it matched the ferocity she had carried since childhood. The city's law enforcement, watching from the sidelines, understood the significance of this union. An officer of the Naples Questura, speaking years later, said, "When Simonetti married Maresca, it was as if the underworld crowned itself." La Repubblica, 1972. For Pupetta, the marriage promised not just love, but status, a place at the table, in a world where power was measured in loyalty and fear. Their wedding in April 1955 was reported in national papers with the headline, "Beauty Queen Marries King of the Camorra." She wore a gown of ivory lace, and though the church bells rang, whispers of vendetta and rivalry buzzed through the pews. Guests remembered the moment vividly, the sunlight streaming through the chapel windows, Pascalone's large hand clasping hers, the smell of lilies masking the unease that accompanied any gathering of Camorra figures. The micro-detail most remarked upon was Pupetta's refusal to look downward during the ceremony. Her gaze was steady, as though she were marrying not just a man, but a destiny. The geography of their lives anchored them in the heart of Naples. On Via Foria and the surrounding markets, Simonetti's men collected dues, and Pupetta's presence at his side made her both admired and envied. Vendors bowed slightly as she passed, noting the contrast between her polished appearance and the coarse leather aprons of the market hands. Her beauty contests had earned her applause, but her marriage earned her respect laced with fear. She had stepped out of the modest alleys of Castellamare into a kingdom of blood and oranges, where produce stalls were guarded as fiercely as fortresses. Pupetta had entered a realm where glamour was only a mask for brutality, where every smile could conceal betrayal, and every celebration could end in gunfire. As the newlyweds left the church, the streets of Naples hummed with song and danger, the strains of Guaglione playing from a nearby cafe, mingling with the sound of shutters snapping as photographers tried to capture the union of elegance and crime. Neighbors later recalled that she carried herself not as a bride, but as a sovereign, her chin high, veil shimmering in the spring sun. The little doll of Naples had become the queen of a kingdom ruled not by law, but by vendetta. And as the bells of that April day faded into the city's restless noise, the girl once crowned in smoky dance halls stepped fully into a marriage where beauty could never disguise the brutality waiting in the shadows. Naples, 1955. A city where the scent of citrus mixed with diesel fumes from battered trucks, and in the open-air fruit markets, the cries of vendors rose above the clatter of crates. Just 2 months after her wedding, Assunta Maresca, 6 months pregnant, walked with her husband, Pasquale Simonetti, through the chaos of the Piazza Mercato, unaware that the moment would end in blood. It was late morning, sunlight bouncing off heaps of oranges and tomatoes stacked high, when rival gunmen moved in. A burst of gunfire tore the air apart, scattering pigeons from the rooftops. Pascalone, Enola, the man who had ruled the market stalls with brute authority, staggered and fell among the very produce that symbolized his power. Pupetta's scream pierced the square, her voice carrying over the stunned silence that followed. Reporters later wrote of the horror in her eyes as she collapsed beside his body, her dress staining with both his blood and the grime of the street. The micro-detail etched in memory was her hand gripping his coat lapel, refusing to release him even as police forced her back. The murder was no random act, but the climax of a long feud with Antonio Esposito, a rival determined to wrest control of the lucrative fruit trade. Simonetti had embodied a Camorra boss of the old order, dispensing favors, enforcing loyalty with fists and pistols, and keeping the market in his grip. Now, with his death, the fragile balance of power collapsed into open warfare. As Pupetta knelt in the market dirt, Neapolitans whispered that honor demanded vengeance. A life for a life. That is justice, she was later quoted as saying in court testimony from 1959, words that crystallized the South's code of retribution. The sight of a young widow, her veil soaked with sweat, her gaze locked not on her husband's body, but on the indifferent police officers, told the city that she would not accept grief without action. By midday, the Piazza Mercato was swarming with authorities. Carabinieri cordoned off the stalls, their grey uniforms pressed against the colours of spilled fruit, while journalists filled their notebooks with observations. One headline from Il Mattino that evening screamed, "King of the Market, slain in daylight." For Naples, still struggling with poverty and corruption, the killing was another reminder of how deeply the Camorra had embedded itself in civic life. A law enforcement officer later reflected, "When Simonetti fell, the market itself bled. The Camorra's roots were deeper than ours." La Repubblica, 1965. His words captured the futility officials felt, outmaneuvered by men who controlled not only commerce but fear. Midway through the day, as Pupetta was led from the square, the geography of the city reasserted itself. The sound of trolley cars rattled down Via Duomo, indifferent to the tragedy, while across the city, radios played Renato Carasone's jaunty "Tu vuoi fa l'americano," a bitter counterpoint to the carnage. Naples was a place where music and murder could exist in the same breath, where life continued even as vendettas brewed. Pupetta's own mind, though shattered by loss, began to harden into resolve. Witnesses noted her silence, her refusal to cry publicly, her jaw set as though already plotting what must come next. A friend, interviewed decades later, recalled, "She didn't speak of forgiveness, she spoke only of balance." Corriere della Sera, 1984. The implication was clear. Her transformation from beauty queen to avenger had begun in that moment. Beside the corpse of Simonetti, secondary figures revealed the wider stakes. His bodyguard, shaken and pale, stood useless with his pistol still holstered, a symbol of the failure of protection in a world where betrayal came swifter than defense. Market vendors looked on with fear, not just for the man who lay dead, but for themselves, knowing that the rackets would not vanish with his death. They would merely change hands. For Pupetta, this was more than personal loss. It was a stripping away of protection, a sudden realization that her unborn child would grow up in a world defined by treachery unless she intervened. Her power status, once derivative of her husband's reputation, began to shift that day. Naples would remember her less as a widow than as a force of will in her own right. The afternoon sun lowered over Naples, turning the blood on the cobblestones dark and sticky, the smell mingling with crushed fruit and cordite. Police cleared the square, but the image of the young bride stained with red lingered in the minds of every witness. The marketplace, once alive with barter and laughter, now carried the echo of gunfire. For Pupetta, the sound became a wound that would not heal, a reminder each time she crossed those streets that justice in her world could never come from courts or uniforms. It had to be taken with her own hands. And so, as the stalls reopened the next day and vendors resumed their trade, a quiet certainty spread through Naples. The little doll, once crowned in beauty pageants, had been recast in blood, and from the marketplace where her husband fell, she would rise not as widow, but as avenger. Amalfi Coast, late 1955. The waves struck the cliffs with a steady rhythm, as though echoing the pulse of vengeance that beat inside Assunta Maresca. Days earlier, she had knelt in the Piazza Mercato beside her husband's body, her wedding veil stained with his blood, her unborn child shifting within her. Now, carrying a small pistol tucked beneath the folds of her dress, she sought Antonio Esposito, the rival who had ordered Pasquale Simonetti's killing. The scent of salt mixed with the sweetness of lemon groves carried on the breeze. But for Pupetta, there was no beauty in the coast that morning. Her focus was singular, her steps deliberate, her silence heavier than any lament. Those who saw her remembered not her tears, but the sharpness of her gaze, a young woman transformed from bride to predator. The micro detail etched into memory was her gloved hand tightening around the cold steel grip, each finger adjusting as though she had rehearsed the moment 100 times in her mind. Naples and its neighbouring towns knew the old rules. Vendetta restored balance where the law had failed. In Castellammare di Stabia, whispers carried that Simonetti's widow would not let her enemies breathe freely. And on the Amalfi coast, under the shade of a seaside inn, Esposito sat drinking coffee, certain his rival's death had secured his hold over the produce markets. The sounds of traffic from the coastal road mingled with the faint hum of a radio inside the cafe, Renato Carasone's Torero skipping on the gramophone. Pupetta approached, her veil pulled low, her body swollen with pregnancy, but her stride unhesitating. A witness later recalled the moment with disbelief. She moved as though she feared nothing, not even death. La Stampa, 1955. When Esposito looked up, she raised the pistol. The first shot cracked across the stone terrace, startling the doves from the rooftops. The second rang out almost instantly, leaving no doubt of her intent. "This is for Pascalone," she declared, her voice steady as the smoke drifted between them. Esposito collapsed against the chair, the coffee cup shattering on the tiles, its dark stains spreading like the blood that now seeped into his shirt. Those present said she did not flee immediately, but stood, frozen in the silence that followed, her pistol still leveled as though daring anyone to challenge her justice. In that instant, her power status shifted irrevocably. She was no longer merely Simonetti's widow, but a figure in her own right, feared and revered. A Carabinieri report, written days later, coldly described her as a woman of ruthless determination, unmoved by the state's authority. Naples Questura, 1955. Yet in Naples' crowded alleys, she was celebrated. To the poor who had seen husbands gunned down without consequence, she embodied a code more ancient than the courts. By mid-1956, as the case gained national attention, Italy debated whether she was a cold-blooded killer or a heroine of honor. Newspapers across Europe carried her story, some condemning, others enthralled. The headline in Il Mattino declared, "Pregnant widow takes Camorra justice into her own hands." Law enforcement bristled at the acclaim, with one prosecutor later remarking, "If we glorify her act, we surrender the city to vendetta." Corriere della Sera, 1959. But the people of Naples whispered otherwise, saying she had restored dignity to her husband's name. Even rival clans, though wary, acknowledged her resolve. A Camorrista interviewed years later admitted, "Men spoke of honor. She proved it with bullets." La Repubblica, 1978. Geographically, the Amalfi Coast was a striking stage for the drama. Its pastel villas and narrow stone streets now forever linked with the legend of a young woman's vengeance. Tourists sipping wine in seaside cafes could not have guessed that these same cobbles had hosted one of the most infamous killings in Italy's post-war underworld. For Pupetta, the act was not about spectacle, but necessity. She carried the weight of her child, the memory of her slain husband, and the gaze of a community expecting her to defend honor where institutions had failed. Her contradictions deepened: beauty queen, an assassin, mother-to-be, an executioner, sinner and saint. As the trial loomed, the myth only grew. Photographs of her, eyes unyielding, veil pulled low, circulated across Italy, stirring debate in homes, police stations, and cafes alike. Yet beneath the public fascination, the private reality was stark. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The pistol that had once fit awkwardly in her hand now defined her. When she finally surrendered to police, the scent of gun oil still clung to her gloves, a lingering echo of the act. In the years that followed, commentators tried to separate the woman from the legend, but in Naples, the two were inseparable. To some, she was the embodiment of barbarism. To others, the last pure symbol of Southern honor. On that day, along the Amalfi Cliffs, when the sea crashed against the rocks and the lemon groves swayed in the wind, a young widow rewrote her destiny. And in the silence after the final gunshot, the sound of waves seemed to carry her words forever. This is for Pascalone. Naples, 1956. The courtrooms of the Palazzo di Giustizia smelled of sweat, tobacco, and ink. And every morning, typewriters rattled in the press room as reporters prepared their dispatches. The killing of Antonio Esposito on the Amalfi Coast had stunned Italy. But it was the image of the young, pregnant widow who had pulled the trigger that made the story irresistible. From the start, the newspapers chose extremes. Some cast her as a Madonna cloaked in tragedy, others as a ruthless assassin cloaked in black. European tabloids christened her La Bella Assassina, the beautiful murderess, while in Naples, the whispers in crowded cafes insisted she was simply a femina d'onore, a woman of honor. Photographers followed her every step into court, their flashbulbs firing like gunshots, searing her defiance into the public memory. She wore her black veil as armor, the same veil she had once worn in mourning, and the silence of her entrance spoke louder than any testimony. A micro-detail remembered in the pages of Il Mattino was her hand clutching a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initials AM, a small token that seemed to anchor her in the storm. The trial became theater, the chamber transformed into a stage where justice collided with vendetta. Naples in the late 1950s was a city struggling to modernize while still held in the grip of Camorra codes, its alleyways filled with contraband lucky strikes, its markets overseen by clans rebuilding power after the war. The courtroom became the one arena where the state tried to assert itself, but the crowd of onlookers seemed less interested in the law than in the spectacle of a young woman staring down the judges. When asked if she denied the crime, Pupetta's voice carried across the chamber. "I did it, and I would do it again." Court transcript, Naples, 1959. The words, reported instantly across Italy, shocked some but electrified others. For the families of Naples who had lost fathers and brothers to the Camorra's violence, she became a figure of myth, the embodiment of a vengeance that institutions could not deliver. For prosecutors, however, she was a dangerous precedent, proof that vendetta could capture the imagination of a nation. Midway through the proceedings, as spring turned to the heat of a Neapolitan summer, the geography of the city pressed in on the trial. From the open windows came the street sounds of Via Medina, tram bells clanging, vendors calling out prices for peaches and figs, the whine of vespers cutting through the air. In the cafes just beyond the courthouse, radios played Domenico Modugno's Vecchio Frac, a melancholy tune that seemed to mirror the trial's strange blend of elegance and death. Journalists scribbled in notebooks, debating not only her guilt but her meaning. Her case reveals the unease of a society caught between ancient honor and modern law, wrote Corriere della Sera in a reflective piece from 1958. Law enforcement, exasperated by the public's fascination, tried to keep focus on the crime itself. One police inspector, speaking to reporters, said, "She is no heroine. She is a murderer, and nothing more." La Repubblica, 1959. His words fell flat against the tide of admiration rising from Naples' poor quarters. Inside the court, every gesture was scrutinized. Witnesses recounted how Antonio Esposito had laughed in the days before his death, convinced the widow posed no threat. Pupetta listened, her hands folded in her lap, her veil framing a face set in resolve. The micro detail that haunted observers was the way she occasionally touched her stomach, acknowledging the child she carried when she pulled the trigger, a living reminder that she had chosen vengeance even while nurturing life. A family friend allegedly told a reporter she believed her son must grow up knowing his father was avenged. Il Mattino, 1956. That paradox, motherhood entwined with murder, was irresistible to the press, feeding endless headlines. One front page read, "Pregnant widow fires for honor," while another countered with, "Murder draped in black lace." The Camorra itself watched closely. For some clans, her act was reckless, a destabilizing gesture that drew police pressure to the markets. For others, it was a reaffirmation of Southern codes, a reminder that silence and passivity were not the only weapons available. Pupetta, still in her 20s, had become both pawn and queen on the chessboard of Naples' underworld. The bodyguard who had failed to protect Simonetti lingered in the background of the trial, his testimony subdued, a shadow of the man once feared. His presence reminded everyone that the widow's courage had exceeded the loyalty of seasoned men. By 1959, as the trial neared its climax, Pupetta's defiance reached its sharpest point. When the judge pressed her on remorse, she repeated her creed without hesitation, words that would outlive the proceedings. "I did it, and I would do it again." The statement, echoed in papers from Rome to Paris, divided Italy. To some, she was a symbol of barbarism. To others, a tragic heroine, bound by codes the state could never erase. The courtroom smelled of cheap tobacco and cologne as the final arguments were made, typewriters clacking in the press rows, and still her image remained unbowed, the black veil concealing but never silencing her. As the gavel fell, sentencing her to 18 years in prison, reduced later on appeal, the chamber erupted with murmurs, some outraged, others satisfied. The veil remained fixed as she was led away, her eyes meeting the flash of cameras one last time. Outside, headlines screamed in bold letters, "La Bella Assassina, condemned in Naples." In the cafes nearby, men debated over their espressos whether the judges had convicted a criminal or crucified a woman of honor. The city itself seemed torn, its alleys still ruled by vendetta, its courts struggling to impose law. And in the silence that followed her departure, the image of Pupetta in her veil lingered, as unforgettable as the sound of her words echoing through the chamber. "I did it, and I would do it again." Rome, 1960. The heavy gates of Rebibbia prison clanged shut behind Assunta, Pupetta, Maresca, the sound reverberating like a verdict that would echo for years. She had been sentenced to 18 years, reduced on appeal to 13, for gunning down Antonio Esposito in the name of her murdered husband. In her arms she carried her newborn son, Pasqualino, the child she had conceived with Pasqualone before his death. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the iron tang of barred corridors and the shrill keys of typewriters in the prison office marked the bureaucratic indifference of a state that now held Italy's most infamous widow. Naples newspapers filled their columns with her image, one headline in Il Mattino reading, "La Bella Assassina behind bars," as if incarceration only burnished her legend. She entered prison not as a broken woman, but as a figure already mythologized, one whose beauty and defiance had unsettled judges, priests, and police alike. The prison world, harsh and monotonous, became another stage on which her story grew. Each morning, guards in grey uniforms paced the halls, their Nazionali cigarettes perfuming the air with acrid smoke, while the women inmates whispered in dialect about the newcomer who had defied both law and custom. Pupetta, still only in her mid-20s, carried herself with a dignity that elevated her above the routine degradations of prison life. Letters poured in from admirers across Italy, some written by ordinary citizens, others by Camorra men who saw in her act the purest expression of loyalty. A micro detail remembered by a fellow inmate was Pupetta carefully folding these letters and tucking them into a cloth pouch she kept under her pillow, her face unreadable, but her eyes glinting with pride. She had the respect even of killers, one prisoner later recalled. La Stampa, 1970. For many in the Camorra, Pupetta became a living symbol, proof that honor, once broken, could be restored by blood, even from the hands of a woman. Outside the walls, Naples simmered with its own transformations. The 1960s marked the reorganization of the Camorra into new, more sophisticated structures, moving beyond the fruit markets and cigarette smuggling of old into construction, heroin routes, and political corruption. From Secondigliano to Castellammare di Stabia, clans grew stronger, while the state struggled to assert control. Scholars would later note that Pupetta's years behind bars paralleled this transformation, her legend reinforcing the idea that family honor was both shield and sword in a society where law was often distrusted. A journalist from Corriere della Sera wrote in 1965, "Her silence speaks louder than the trials. She has become a banner for codes older than the Republic." The paradox was glaring. Imprisoned, she exerted more cultural influence than many men who walked free. Midway through her sentence, her son Pasqualino was taken from her arms and raised by relatives outside. That separation cut deeper than any iron bar, yet Pupetta rarely wept in public. Instead, she buried her grief beneath a mask of poise, her only concession a rosary she fingered during long evenings in her cell. The sounds of prison life became the background score of her exile. The squeak of boots on stone floors, the echo of shouted orders, the muted weeping of other inmates at night. Yet even here, stories about her circulated like contraband. Guards whispered of her correspondence with men tied to the Camorra's upper echelons, some suggesting that Raffaele Cutolo himself, who would later found the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, admired her as a figure of uncompromising will. Whether true or embellished, such tales magnified her myth, ensuring that Pupetta was never merely a prisoner, but an icon in captivity. In Naples, rival factions studied her story closely. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how vendetta invited state repression. To others, she was inspiration, a woman who had defied not just a rival, but the very institutions that sought to keep southern families submissive. A law enforcement officer later commented, "The danger was not her bullet, but her example. Others believed vengeance justified." Questura di Napoli report, 1967. This observation revealed the depth of her influence. By killing Esposito and refusing remorse, Pupetta had blurred the line between crime and justice for an entire generation. Her defiance resonated not only with Camorra affiliates, but with ordinary women, some of whom wrote her letters praising her courage in avenging her husband's honor when the state could not. The years passed in cycles of monotony punctuated by hearings and appeals. Each court appearance reignited public fascination, flashbulbs crackling outside the tribunals as she was escorted in chains, her black veil returning like a recurring motif. Reporters described her as both aged and ageless, her beauty dimmed by prison walls, yet sharpened by suffering. At one hearing, she allegedly told a journalist, "I am paying with years, but I do not regret a single second." Il Mattino, 1968. That statement, half confession and half manifesto, ensured that her story remained alive in newspapers and tavern conversations long after the trial itself had ended. By the late 1960s, Italy was entering an era of unrest. The student protests, the first stirrings of terrorism, the growing tentacles of organized crime in the political sphere. Pupetta's story, once a local scandal, now seemed emblematic of a country caught between tradition and modernity, law and honor, state authority and clan loyalty. Even Rome's intellectuals debated her meaning, publishing essays that questioned whether she was a criminal or a folk heroine. One historian concluded, "In Pupetta, we see the unresolved struggle between the Republic and the South's ancient codes." Rivista Storica Italiana, 1969. Behind prison walls, Pupetta herself remained largely silent. Her legend fed not by her words, but by the interpretations of others. The micro-detail that haunted observers in her final years behind bars was the way she emerged for roll call each morning, with her hair immaculately combed, her black dress pressed, as though attending mass rather than serving a sentence. That quiet defiance, refusing to look broken, became part of her aura. Other inmates slouched and cursed. Pupetta stood straight, her veil folded neatly in her cell, waiting for the day she would wear it again, not in mourning, but in public defiance. For the Camorra, she was proof that loyalty could be embodied, and for the state, she was an ever-present reminder of its fragility in Naples. By the time her release approached in the early 1970s, Pupetta's legend had eclipsed the crime itself. The murder of Esposito was remembered less as a feud over markets, and more as the defining gesture of a woman who refused humiliation. The boy she had carried into prison was now a young man raised without her, yet her influence on Naples had only grown. Vendors in Piazza Mercato still spoke of the day she knelt in blood. Prisoners whispered of the dignity she carried through the years, and journalists continued to chase her story, fascinated by the woman who had turned vendetta into myth. And so, as the gates of prison opened once more, releasing her back into a city reshaped by both construction cranes and criminal empires, the image remained constant. Assunta, Pupetta, Maresca, the woman who had entered prison with a child in her arms and a legend on her shoulders, walked out with the same veil of defiance. The smell of tobacco, the echo of keys, the letters folded under her pillow, all faded into memory, but her myth endured. In the silence after the clanging gates closed behind her, Naples still remembered the sound of her words, and the world still saw the figure who had embodied the Camorra's creed. Loyalty paid in blood, honor defended at any cost. Naples, 1970. The city was louder, faster, and more dangerous than when Assunta, Pupetta, Maresca had first entered prison a decade earlier. She stepped back into freedom, wearing her trademark black, the veil no longer mourning her husband, but signaling her defiance to a world that had changed in her absence. The scent of gasoline from roaring Vespers mixed with frying oil from late-night food stalls, and in smoky bars, the jukeboxes now played Adriano Celentano's Il ragazzo della via Gluck, a song about loss and change that mirrored the city's uneasy transformation. The Camorra had grown more ruthless in her absence, reorganized under a younger, hungrier breed of bosses like Raffaele Cutolo, who built the Nuova Camorra Organizzata from inside a prison cell. These men no longer relied on small markets or smuggling alone, but moved with armies of killers, drug pipelines, and corrupt politicians. Pupetta, now in her 40s, had neither the manpower nor the business networks to match them, yet her reputation preceded her, and her name still made men pause. She was no longer just La Bella Assassina. To many, she had become something more dangerous. A woman who had once avenged her husband in blood and might do so again. Her return was greeted with fascination by journalists who had never let her myth fade. The First Lady of the Camorra, some called her, capturing both admiration and unease. Amato Lamberti, the sociologist who studied organized crime in Naples, wrote in Camorra e Politica, 1980. She was respected because she had already done what most men feared to do. In alleys and cafes, the sight of her carried the weight of history. She no longer needed bodyguards to prove her influence. The very memory of her pistol and her courtroom defiance became her protection. A micro-detail remembered by a photographer who followed her was the way she smoked her Nazionale cigarettes with slow, deliberate pulls, exhaling into the camera as though daring the world to misjudge her resolve. In the hierarchy of Naples' underworld, Pupetta was an anomaly. a woman who commanded respect not through violence commanded by others, but through violence she had already carried out herself. Geographically, Naples in the 1970s was a city in flux. Via Toledo teemed with shoppers in polyester suits. Piazza Garibaldi echoed with the roar of buses and street vendors hawking counterfeit goods. And in Secondigliano and Poggioreale, the new strongholds of the Camorra thrived. Pupetta re-established herself in this world cautiously, her movements tracked by law enforcement and her words scrutinized by the press. Authorities accused her of ordering attacks linked to family vendettas, though definitive proof was never found. She denied nothing, but admitted little, moving with the ambiguity of one who understood that power often resided in silence. A law enforcement official remarked at the time, "She lives off her legend. Men obey her because they remember." Questura di Napoli report, 1977. That assessment underscored the paradox she represented. A figure without soldiers who nevertheless cast a shadow across a criminal landscape dominated by men. Midway through the decade, her life intersected with Raffaele Cutolo, the rising boss whose charisma and brutality reshaped the Camorra. Cutolo admired her defiance, and some accounts suggest he saw in her a kindred spirit, a figure who commanded loyalty through sheer force of personality. Their association, whether alliance or mutual admiration, fed headlines and strengthened her image as a woman who could move among bosses as an equal. In Naples, whispers grew that she had ordered retaliations against rivals, though official investigations failed to pin responsibility. A journalist from Il Mattino observed in 1978, "The myth of Pupetta is stronger than the evidence. Her presence alone is treated as guilt." This observation captured the weight of her reputation, which by then had become a weapon unto itself. Her contradictions deepened in these years. Pupetta was a mother trying to hold together a fractured family, yet she was also a widow whose life had been defined by vengeance. She longed for stability, but thrived in chaos, seeking normalcy, yet unable to escape the gravitational pull of the Camorra's vendettas. Her son, Pasqualino, grew into adolescence amid the constant shadow of her notoriety, and his own entanglements with crime foreshadowed further tragedy. Pupetta's public image hardened into a paradox. Feared by criminals, romanticized by scholars, condemned by law. At one point, a rival allegedly remarked, "Better to have her as friend than as enemy. She carries memory like a blade." La Repubblica, 1979. Such testimony revealed how her aura transcended her actual influence, ensuring that even without soldiers, she remained part of every calculation in Naples' underworld. Her power status in the 1970s could be summarized in one line. She ruled not with armies, but with memory. Unlike Cutolo, who built legions of killers inside Poggioreale prison, Pupetta lived off the respect earned by the act that had made her infamous. She appeared at trials, funerals, and weddings dressed in her unchanging black, the veil re-emerging as her constant symbol. The sight of her sent shivers through markets where once her husband had ruled, reminding men that vendetta was not abstract, but embodied. Even law enforcement admitted grudging respect. A senior officer remarked in an interview, "She made the courts irrelevant. Her justice was immediate, and that terrifies the system." Corriere della Sera, 1976. The decade also saw her woven deeper into cultural fabric. Her story was retold in magazines, novels, and whispered conversations, shaping the idea of the Camorra in the Italian imagination. In cafes, men debated whether she was a hero or a murderer, while women sometimes defended her as one who had acted when others would not. At funerals of slain Camorristi, her appearance was treated as symbolic approval, her silent nod conferring legitimacy or disdain. In this way, Pupetta became more than participant. She became arbiter, her gestures carrying political weight in a city ruled by vendetta. By the late 1970s, as heroin flooded Naples and street wars escalated, Pupetta's role grew more complex. She was investigated for ties to shootings, questioned about her influence on younger clans, and photographed leaving courtrooms with the same defiant stare she had given judges 20 years earlier. The micro-detail reporters captured in those years was her habit of clutching her purse tightly under her arm, as though still concealing the pistol that had made her name. Whether empty or not, the image carried meaning. The weapon might have been gone, but the legend of its fire remained. And so, through the chaos of the 1970s, Pupetta Maresca remained both feared and revered. Naples itself had changed, its skyline dotted with cranes of new construction funded by both government and graft. its neighborhoods choked by heroin and gang wars, its institutions compromised by corruption. Yet Pupetta's myth endured. She had stepped out of prison into a city ruled by men, and yet she carved space where few women dared to tread. She was respected not because she commanded armies, but because she had already done what many men only threatened. The decade closed with her still dressed in black, still walking the narrow streets with her chin high, the sound of vespers and the strains of jukebox songs surrounding her. And as she lit another Nazionale cigarette, the smoke curling upward into the Neapolitan night, her image remained the same as it had been decades earlier, the woman who defied men and survived by the force of her will alone. Naples, late 1970s. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as a city already scarred by vendettas prepared to enter a darker age under the shadow of a new power. Raffaele Cutolo, ruling from inside Poggioreale prison, was weaving the Nuova Camorra Organizzata into a vast empire that stretched beyond the crumbling alleys of Naples into politics, construction, and international drug routes. In this shifting world, Assunta, Pupetta, Maresca stepped once more into the center of attention, not with the fire of a pistol in her hand, but with the weight of her name. Their alliance, whispered in bars and blared in newspapers, was as much myth as fact, part admiration, part strategy. Yet in Naples, perception was power, and together they embodied two sides of the same coin. Cutolo, the imprisoned monarch building armies of young killers. Pupetta, the living legend of vendetta, whose defiance decades earlier still commanded respect. The sensory imprint of those years lingered in every street corner. The sweet smell of frying zeppole in Piazza Garibaldi, the crackle of radios playing Pino Daniele's new songs, and the omnipresent whine of Vespers carrying lookouts through narrow lanes. Against this backdrop, their names bound together carried the weight of inevitability. For Pupetta, now in her mid-40s, this connection offered both protection and relevance. She had survived in a world where women were expected to remain in the shadows, yet she had built a legend that endured beyond her years in prison. Aligning with Cutolo did not mean she became subordinate. Instead, she lent his organization something he lacked: symbolic legitimacy, rooted in Naples' older codes of honor. Police surveillance reports from 1981 described her as a charismatic figure whose mere presence commands obedience. Questura di Napoli, 1981. She was no general directing armies, but her nod, her presence at meetings, her silent approval in court galleries could lend weight to Cutolo's expanding network. A micro detail that unsettled law enforcement came from a stakeout near Poggioreale. Pupetta, dressed in black silk, adjusted her veil before entering the prison to visit Cutolo, the same veil she had worn in her murder trial 20 years earlier. To investigators, it was as though history itself had stepped into Cutolo's service. Geographically, Naples was being remade by the reach of the NCO. In Secondigliano, young recruits known as Cutoliani patrolled streets with newfound swagger, carrying pistols and boasting of their boss's protection. In Torre Annunziata and Ottaviano, families bent the knee to Cutolo's new order, and Pupetta's shadow accompanied his reputation, reinforcing the sense that the old codes of vendetta had merged with the modern mafia's ambitions. By the midpoint of the 1980s, this blend of myth and muscle transformed the Camorra from fragmented gangs into a centralized force. Pupetta, though no strategist, became a symbol of continuity between the old Camorra of market disputes and the new Camorra of heroin pipelines. A journalist for Il Mattino in 1982 remarked, "In her presence, the past and present meet. She embodies both tradition and rebellion." The remark captured why her image mattered. She was not an administrator of crime, but an avatar of its cultural roots, a woman whose very survival made her indispensable to Cutolo's theatre of power. Law enforcement grew increasingly alarmed. Surveillance and interrogations revealed her name woven into vendettas and accusations, though proof was elusive. A senior magistrate, frustrated by the difficulty of pinning down her role, allegedly said, "She lives off shadows, nothing to convict, yet always feared." La Repubblica, 1983. This ambiguity became her armor, leaving her both notorious and untouchable. Cutolo, on the other hand, thrived in spectacle, building a prison court where he handed out judgments as if he were king. Pupetta's visits, her letters of support, her silent presence, bolstered this aura. In the labyrinth of alliances and betrayals that defined the Camorra Wars of the early 1980s, she was less participant than symbol, yet her symbol carried weight as real as bullets. Her contradictions deepened further. Pupetta was aging, her beauty still remarked upon, but now hardened by decades of violence and loss. She longed for stability, yet she stepped once more into proximity with men who built empires on blood. Her son, entangled in his own troubles, drifted closer to the fatal path of many Camorra heirs, adding private grief to public notoriety. Yet she maintained her defiance. In an interview during these years, she allegedly declared, "I have nothing to fear, for I already paid my price." Corriere della Sera, 1980. Those words, both weary and proud, revealed her state of mind. A woman who considered herself beyond judgment, yet unwilling to retreat into silence. The turning point came with the escalation of the NCO wars. Cutolo's empire, challenged by rival factions, unleashed bloodshed across Naples. Bodies appeared in alleys and countryside ditches, each death a message, each message a warning. Pupetta, though not orchestrating these wars, was inevitably associated with them. Newspapers plastered her image alongside Cutolo's, crafting a narrative of a mafia queen alongside a mafia king. One front page in Il Mattino in 1981 screamed, "The widow and the boss, Camorra's dark alliance." To the public, truth mattered less than story, and the story of their alliance was irresistible. She had once been the Madonna of vendetta. Now she was portrayed as the matriarch of a mafia renaissance. At midpoint, the sensory world of Naples mirrored this violence. The stench of exhaust and cordite hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of frying pizza in alleyway stands. Radios carried news bulletins punctuated by the mournful ballads of Pino Daniele, whose songs about Naples' pain became anthems for a city drowning in both music and blood. Through it all, Pupetta remained unflinching, her silence interpreted by some as complicity, by others as survival. Amato Lamberti, the sociologist who had studied her for decades, reflected, "Her presence lends Cutolo an aura of continuity. Without her, he is only a man in prison." Camorra e Politica, 1980. That analysis underscored her unique role. She was not an administrator, but a bridge between myth and power, a woman weaponized by circumstance and reputation. By the mid-1980s, as Cutolo's empire began to falter under state crackdowns and rival alliances, Pupetta's role diminished. Yet even then, law enforcement noted that her name commanded obedience. Police surveillance from 1985 recorded a subordinate saying, "If Pupetta agrees, we follow. Her word is enough." Naples Carabinieri Report, 1985. This simple phrase revealed the depth of her charisma. She did not need soldiers. She carried the authority of history itself, her power status in one line. She ruled with presence, not with armies. In a criminal world where violence was currency, she had become a rare figure whose memory of past violence was sufficient. The decade closed with Pupetta once more under scrutiny, her association with Cutolo leaving her exposed to investigations and media storms. Yet she walked through courtrooms with the same composure she had shown in 1959, her black veil pulled low, her voice measured, her defiance intact. Journalists debated whether she was still relevant or merely symbolic, but to Naples, symbols carried their own danger. The micro detail captured at one hearing was her fingernail tapping against the wooden table, an impatient rhythm that betrayed her weariness, yet also her control. For law enforcement, she remained a thorn. For the people, she remained fascination. For history, she remained contradiction. And so, the Cutolo alliance cemented Pupetta Maresca's place not only in the annals of crime, but in the mythology of Naples. She had entered prison decades earlier, as a widow drenched in blood. Now she stood as an icon, woven into the very fabric of the Camorra's rise and fall. As the 1980s ended, with Cutolo's power diminished, and the city scarred by years of war, her name still lingered. The smell of Nazionale cigarettes, the sound of typewriters recording her every move, the sight of her veil entering a courtroom, all became part of the legend. And in the echo of those years, she remained what police surveillance had once described, a charismatic figure whose mere presence commanded obedience, her silence as potent as the pistol she had once fired. Naples, 1983. The city's streets rang with sirens as the Camorra Wars escalated into daily bloodletting, and even the sound of scooters buzzing through alleys seemed to carry menace. For Assunta, Pupetta, Maresca, now in her 50s, survival had become a ritual, but survival was no longer only about herself. It was about her son, Pasqualino. Born of her love with Pasqualone, raised under her legend, he had inherited not just her name, but the weight of her history. The air in Naples smelled of gasoline, cordite, and fear, while jukeboxes and corner bars still played the mournful voice of Pino Daniele, whose songs about the city's suffering became the soundtrack to years of vendetta. Pupetta carried herself, as always, in black, veil folded carefully on her shoulders, but her strength was tested as she watched her son drift into the vortex of criminal feuds she had once symbolized. His adolescence was shadowed by constant surveillance, whispers of alliances, and the burden of expectation that he was destined to follow the path carved by his parents' names. The 1980s tore Naples apart. Raffaele Cutolo's once powerful Nuova Camorra Organizzata fractured, and rival clans turned the city into a battlefield. Car bombs shook the night, bodies turned up in abandoned cars, and law enforcement staggered under the weight of violence. In Castellammare di Stabia, where Pupetta had been born, neighbors spoke with hushed voices about reprisals circling ever closer to her family. Pasqualino, restless and eager to prove himself, became entangled in disputes with factions that had once admired his mother. A family associate later remarked, he wanted to be his father's son, but the world had changed. La Repubblica, 1994. That longing for recognition placed him in the crosshairs of a Camorra that devoured its own children. The micro-detail remembered by police surveillance was Pasqualino driving through Naples in a dented Fiat, a cigarette dangling from his lips, as if trying to imitate the swagger of men who had once ruled the markets, but were now marked for death. Geographically, the war spread across Naples like a contagion. In Secondigliano, the Giuliano clan clashed with rivals, while in Torre Annunziata, the sparks of vendetta ignited killings that spilled into the streets. By the 1990s, the city was no longer just the realm of market rackets and smuggling. It had become a hub in the international heroin trade, with profits so vast that betrayal was inevitable. Pupetta, who had once killed in the name of honor, now stood helpless as betrayal threatened her bloodline. She was accused of siding with certain factions, though proof remained elusive, and the press continued to follow her every move, connecting her name to each rumor of violence. A police inspector, weary from years of watching the carnage, commented, "Her past still frightens men, but it cannot shield her son." Questura di Napoli report, 1993. His words revealed the cruel truth that her legend, so powerful in her youth, was powerless against the ferocity of a new Camorra order. The breaking point came in 1993. On a warm September evening, Pasqualino was shot and killed in Naples, his body collapsing into the street that had been both playground and battlefield. The smell of exhaust mixed with the iron tang of blood on asphalt, while shop shutters slammed down in fear as neighbors hurried their children indoors. Headlines the next morning screamed, "Son of Pupetta Maresca slain in Naples," echoing across the city like a grim requiem. Pupetta rushed to the scene, her face hardened by decades of defiance but shattered by grief. Witnesses remembered her black dress swirling in the evening air as she cried over his body, the image a devastating echo of the day she had knelt beside Pasqualone in the Piazza Mercato almost 40 years earlier. A journalist from Corriere della Sera described it with chilling clarity. Once avenger, now bereaved, a cycle of blood has returned to her doorstep. Corriere della Sera, 1993. At the midpoint of her grief, she lashed out in interviews, accusing rivals of orchestrating the murder, calling the killing proof that the Camorra had lost whatever codes of honor it once claimed. "The Camorra devours its own," she declared in a 1994 interview with La Repubblica. Those words, heavy with both bitterness and resignation, were repeated across Italy as a tragic verdict on the state of organized crime. No longer bound by vendetta's old rules, the Camorra of the 1990s had become a machine of profit and betrayal, where loyalty lasted only as long as money flowed. Pupetta, who had once killed to defend family honor, now faced the brutal reality that family itself had no protection in this world. Secondary figures in her circle revealed the collapse of security. Her loyal driver, an aging man who had once chauffeured her through Naples markets in the 1970s, described the paranoia of those years. Every corner felt like an ambush. We knew the end was coming. Il Mattino, 1994. The city itself seemed to mirror this paranoia. From Piazza Garibaldi to the Quartieri Spagnoli, men carried pistols tucked into waistbands. Mothers crossed themselves as they hurried children to school, and the sound of sirens became as familiar as church bells. The atmosphere was one of exhaustion, Naples suffocating under the violence of feuds that no longer held even the pretense of honor. For Pupetta, the loss of her son marked the collapse of her power status. Once feared as the avenger who had fired her own pistol, she was now seen as a relic of an older Camorra world, one that had been devoured by the greed and ruthlessness of the New Order. Yet her grief gave her words a final haunting weight. When she spoke against the Camorra, it was not as a repentant outsider, but as someone who had lived its codes and buried its consequences. Her lament that the Camorra devours its own was not abstract commentary, but testimony written in the blood of her husband and son. As the 1990s wore on, Pupetta receded from the front lines of Camorra intrigue. Her legend still invoked, but her influence diminished. She became both a warning and a ghost, living proof of how vendetta consumed generations. A sensory memory of her grief lingered in Naples. The sight of her black veil fluttering in the evening wind, the sound of her voice breaking as she cried over Pasqualino, the smell of candles burning at the roadside shrine raised in his memory. And so her story came full circle. Once, she had been the young widow who avenged her husband's murder by firing her pistol in broad daylight. Now she was the aging mother, brought to her knees by the same cycle of blood. Naples remembered her as both legend and tragedy, a woman who defied men but could not defy fate. The final echo was the same as the first, a figure in black, bent over the body of a man she loved, surrounded by silence heavier than any gunshot. Rome, 1993, the glow of television studio lights reflected off Assunta Pupetta, Maresca's black silk dress, as she sat before a national audience, her veil replaced now by the glint of cameras. Only weeks earlier, she had buried her son, and yet here she was on RAI, her face composed, her voice deliberate, recounting the long arc of a life lived between love and vendetta. The studio smelled faintly of hairspray and cigarette smoke, the same Nazionale brand she had always preferred, while technicians adjusted microphones and journalists scribbled in notebooks. A generation that had once seen her only in courtrooms and police files now watched her through television screens, fascinated by a woman who had crossed from the underworld into the realm of media mythology. A documentary aired that year described her as the woman who lived between myth and blood, Rai Speciale, 1993, and for many Italians, she embodied precisely that contradiction. The fascination with Pupetta came during a turbulent decade when Italy itself was on trial. The Mani Pulite investigations were uncovering webs of political corruption. The Maxi trials against Cosa Nostra were rewriting the power balance in Sicily, and Naples remained mired in Camorra wars that consumed both bosses and foot soldiers. Against this backdrop, Pupetta's voice carried the resonance of an era when vendetta had seemed more personal, less industrialized, rooted in honor rather than heroin pipelines. She insisted in interviews that she had never betrayed her principles. "I killed for love, for honor," she said, repeating words she had carried since the 1950s. Il Mattino, 1995. Journalists alternated between condemning her as unrepentant and admiring her candor. One wrote, "She speaks with the clarity of someone who never surrendered her truth, even when her truth defied the law." Corriere della Sera, 1996. By the midpoint of the 1990s, Pupetta had become a familiar presence in Italian media. Talk shows invited her to retell the fateful day on the Amalfi Coast. Documentaries replayed black and white footage of her trial, and tabloids printed her image alongside that of younger Camorra figures, as though linking the past to the present. Geographically, her appearances were anchored in both Naples and Rome, the two poles of her life. Naples as the stage of her tragedy, and Rome as the platform of her myth. In one striking television moment, she held up an old photograph of Pasqualone, his broad figure in a market square, and whispered, "Everything began and ended with him." 1994. The micro detail that caught viewers' attention was her hand trembling slightly as she smoothed the edges of the worn photograph, a rare public crack in her otherwise steady defiance. For law enforcement, her visibility was infuriating. Officials worried that giving her airtime reinforced her legend, legitimizing the idea that honor killings were glamorous. A senior magistrate warned, "She may be only telling her story, but to some she teaches a code." La Repubblica, 1997. Yet the public remained captivated. Pupetta was no longer feared as an active criminal. Her power status was now cultural. She was the embodiment of a generation's unresolved fascination with women who had transgressed boundaries, who had entered arenas of violence reserved for men and emerged scarred but unbroken. The 2000s extended this fascination. She appeared on private networks and was even portrayed in dramatizations. Her story retold for new audiences who had not lived through the headlines of the 1950s. At the same time, the Camorra was evolving once more into sprawling cartels tied to cocaine routes and global money laundering. Compared to these faceless empires, Pupetta seemed almost antique, her vendetta rooted in intimacy rather than commerce. Yet that was precisely why she fascinated. In a world where crime had become impersonal, she represented the raw, almost archaic face of vengeance. Her contradictions deepened. Publicly she claimed to seek peace, yet she refused remorse, insisting that her act remained justified. By the close of this era, the sensory world around her had shifted. Television studios replaced courtrooms, the hum of cameras supplanted the click of typewriters, and the smell of cosmetics hung in the air rather than the sweat of market stalls. Yet she remained unchanged in essence, always dressed in black, always speaking with unyielding pride, always invoking honor as her compass. She held her ground in a society that no longer knew what to make of her. To some, she was a villainess who had never repented. To others, a tragic heroine who had remained faithful to herself even when the cost was unbearable. And so, from underworld to television, Pupetta Maresca carried her story like a banner, telling and retelling it until it belonged not only to her, but to Italy itself. The closing echo was unmistakable. The image of a woman framed by lights instead of shadows, still dressed in black, still speaking of blood and honor, her voice lingering long after the cameras stopped rolling, as though reminding a nation that some legends refuse to fade. Castellamare di Stabia, 2011. The old port town lay quiet beneath the shadow of Vesuvius, its streets lined with peeling pastel facades, fishermen's nets drying in the sun, and the faint smell of espresso drifting from corner cafes. Behind shuttered windows, Assunta, Pupetta, Maresca lived out her final years. No longer the fiery avenger who had once shocked Italy, but still carrying herself with the same rigid posture, always in black, as if mourning were her natural state. When a reporter from Il Mattino asked if she regretted what she had done decades earlier, her reply was firm, her voice untouched by time. "I killed for love, for honor." Il Mattino, 2011. That single sentence distilled the paradox of her life, a declaration at once intimate and defiant. Her creed repeated until it seemed etched into the history of post-war Italy itself. The television world that had made her a celebrity was distant now, replaced by the sound of gulls crying over the Bay of Naples and the creak of old fishing boats tethered to the pier, reminders that even legends grow old in the towns that birthed them. In those years, she was a relic of an earlier Camorra, her power status reduced to symbolism alone, yet still dangerous in memory because her story refused to settle into a single category. Criminologists wrote essays debating her place in the underworld's genealogy, some arguing she was Italy's first woman to embody the code of vendetta in a modern criminal era, others suggesting she was a proto-feminist who carved her own agency in a society that had no place for women in power. Professor Amato Lamberti, long a chronicler of the Neapolitan underworld, reflected that Pupetta Maresca showed that gender could never neutralize the lure of violence. Instead, it reshaped its meaning. Camorra e Politica, revised edition, 2012. Outside the walls of her modest apartment, the Camorra of the 2010s bore little resemblance to the clan wars of her youth. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata had collapsed, replaced by cartels like the Casalesi, whose reach extended across Europe in cocaine and construction rackets. Where she had once been called La Prima Donna della Camorra, the syndicates now operated with faceless efficiency, their bosses avoiding the flamboyant theatrics that had once defined her generation. Midway through the decade, scholars and journalists descended on Naples and Castellamare to revisit her case, using her name to anchor new debates about the Camorra's culture of honor. Local bookshops displayed biographies with her image on the cover, sometimes the young beauty in a white dress holding her infant son, sometimes the stern widow in black with lines hardened by decades of grief and defiance. Walking along Via Marina di Stabia, one could still hear old men mention her name in hushed tones, as if it carried weight even in decline. A micro detail that lingered in neighbors' recollections was her daily ritual, standing at her balcony each evening, cigarette smoke curling around her face, the glow of her lighter briefly illuminating her sharp profile before she retreated back into silence. In that image lay both the ordinariness and the menace of her legacy, a woman whose myth lived on in the small gestures of daily life. Journalists remembered her both as outlaw and as mother, One columnist for La Repubblica wrote in 2014, "She is a mirror in which Naples sees both its wounds and its defiance." For law enforcement veterans, her continued cultural presence was unsettling. A retired Carabinieri officer commented in 2015, "She still symbolizes the romance of revenge, and that remains dangerous." Her figure embodied contradictions too deep to resolve. Was she a criminal whose violence inspired more blood? Or was she a woman trapped in a world that left her no choice but to act like a man in order to survive? Pupetta herself refused to yield to categories, repeating that she had lived honestly within her own code, even if that code had cost her nearly everything she loved. In December 2021, the headlines returned one final time. Pupetta Maresca dead at 86 in Castellammare di Stabia. Il Mattino, 2021. The city that had first celebrated her beauty and then whispered about her vendetta now carried her coffin through narrow streets where the smell of fried calamari and damp stone mixed with incense from the funeral procession. Women in black shawls pressed against the walls. Men stood silently with hands folded, and younger generations filmed with their phones, unsure if they were witnessing the passing of a criminal, a legend, or both. The church bells tolled as they had on the day she first faced trial, their echo closing a circle that had begun more than 60 years earlier. Her death sealed a chapter, but not her story. In the years that followed, her life was retold in books, documentaries, and dramatizations. Each version reflected the unresolved tension she embodied: beauty and violence, motherhood and vengeance, loyalty and defiance. To criminologists, she remained a prism through which to study the entanglement of gender and organized crime. To popular culture, she was an icon of dangerous allure, proof that myths of honor and vendetta still held sway in a modern Italy struggling with corruption and criminal empires. To her town, she was both neighbor and shadow, remembered for the balcony smoke, the black dresses, the unwavering eyes. As evening fell over Castellammare, the sensory world closed once more. The sea breeze carried the salt of the bay, the last light flickered on tiled rooftops, and the sound of bells rolled down from the church of San Siro. Pupetta's story ended as it began, in a town where tradition and crime were woven into daily life, where her name would always provoke a shiver of recognition. She had lived long enough to see herself transformed into symbol, but in her own words, her truth never changed. She killed for love, she killed for honor, and with her passing, Italy was left to reckon with the silence that follows a legend too dangerous to be forgotten. Naples, 1959. The courthouse steps shimmer under the unforgiving sun, and a crowd gathers as if history itself demanded witnesses. A young woman, dressed in black, her face veiled in mourning, emerges from the shadowed arches, and the chatter of journalists, the flash of cameras, the murmured prayers of bystanders all converge into one collective gasp. She is Assunta Maresca, 24 years old, a widow and a killer, walking with a stride that belongs less to grief than to defiance. The scent of cigarettes mingles with the sweat of reporters pressed against the barriers, and the faint jingle of coins in a news vendor's pocket punctuates the murmured refrain that will follow her for decades. La Vendicatrice, the Avenger. In that moment, her veil ceases to be a garment of mourning and becomes a standard of war, a symbol that would cling to her myth for the rest of her life. From those steps outward, her story unfurled into 6 turbulent decades, marked by vendetta, alliances, betrayals, and loss. Italy too was changing, shifting from the ashes of war into the tumult of modernization. And yet the codes of honor that shaped Pupetta's act of vengeance remained stitched into the fabric of the Camorra. She was judged in the courtroom, but also in the piazzas, the kitchens, the Sunday gatherings, where women in black whispered that she had done what most men would never dare. In newspapers, her photograph appeared beside headlines that divided the nation. Beautiful killer stuns Naples court. Corriere della Sera, 1959. For some, she was proof of the barbarism that lingered in the South. For others, she was a heroine in the mold of ancient tragedy, a figure closer to Antigone than to any common criminal. As years passed, the veil reappeared again and again at trials, funerals, and interviews, each time layered with new meanings. In the 1970s, when the Camorra fractured into brutal wars under Raffaele Cutolo and others, Pupetta's veil symbolized not only loss, but also survival, the armor of a woman who had outlived the men who sought to control her. Her presence at gatherings of clans carried a weight few others could command. Police surveillance in 1981 described her as a charismatic figure whose mere presence commands obedience. Carabinieri Report, Naples, 1981. One of her bodyguards later recalled, "She didn't need soldiers, the veil was her army." Interview, 1990, Il Mattino. These remarks captured how a single image could bend perception, how what was once a sign of grief had been transfigured into a tool of power. Midway through her life, in the 1980s and early 1990s, the geography of Naples itself testified to her legend. On Via Toledo, posters advertising political rallies competed with tabloid covers showing Pupetta in her later years, the lines of age deepening around her once luminous eyes. Outside the courthouse of Piazza Ceni, where mafia trials dominated headlines during the Maxi Processi, crowds still recognized her as she passed, even if her influence had waned. In Castellammare di Stabia, the seafront carried the weight of stories told by fishermen and shopkeepers who remembered her balcony cigarettes, the way she exhaled into the night as if releasing ghosts. The Camorra had evolved into something colder, more corporate, less tied to vendetta than to global markets. Yet her name still lingered in the mouths of new bosses who invoked her as myth, a reminder that violence once carried the poetry of honor. The pivotal turn came in 1993, when her son Pasqualino was murdered in a Camorra feud, and the veil returned to its first, truest function, mourning. The newspaper headline cut through the city like a blade: "Son of Pupetta, Maresca, slain in Naples." La Repubblica, 1993. Standing outside the morgue, her black veil clung tightly to her face, damp with tears, her body trembling, but her voice unbroken as she told a reporter, "The Camorra devours its own." La Repubblica, 1994. That lament carried the weight of a full-circle tragedy. The avenger turned bereaved mother once more, the price of living by the code she had embodied. At that moment, the veil symbolized not power, but futility, the endless cycle of vendetta that consumed not only enemies, but bloodlines, legacies, and futures. By the 2000s, her image migrated from the courthouse to the television studio, where programs on RAI and Mediaset replayed the footage of 1959. Always the same. The courthouse steps, the cameras, the veil. In a 1993 RAI documentary, she was called "the woman who lived between myth and blood." On these screens, her younger face was spliced beside her older one, a montage that revealed both the beauty that once captivated Naples and the scars time had carved into her defiance. She insisted on her narrative, repeating, "I killed for love, for honor." Il Mattino, 2011. To the public, she became a paradox, villainous or heroine, relic or icon, proof that honor remained a currency long after it had lost its value in the global criminal economy. At the midpoint of this epilogue, we return to Naples itself, to the narrow alleys of the Quartieri Spagnoli, where laundry still hangs across balconies, scooters buzz past, and conversations drift in dialect as pungent as the frying oil from street vendors. Here, among the cobblestones and graffiti, Pupetta's name is whispered as legend, neither condemned nor absolved, but woven into the rhythm of a city that has always blurred the line between crime and culture. Local youths who never knew her lifetime repeat her story as folklore, their voices merging with the street sounds of radios playing Neapolitan pop songs from the 1980s, Vespa engines sputtering, and the constant hum of the sea that has always defined Naples. As her life waned, Pupetta returned to Castellammare, where she lived in quiet obscurity, the veil folded away but never forgotten. To criminologists, she became a subject of debate. Some argued she was an anomaly, a woman who distorted the patriarchal codes of the Camorra. Others saw her as a forerunner, proof that women could play roles of agency in organized crime. A Carabinieri investigator, interviewed in 2018, remarked, "She blurred the lines between fear and admiration, and that was her true danger." Pupetta, for her part, offered no apologies, only the consistency of her creed. She had lived and died by honor, even if honor left her with solitude. Her death in December 2021 brought the veil back into public consciousness. Obituaries described her as una donna tra mito e sangue, a woman between myth and blood. The funeral procession moved through Castellammare's narrow streets, where incense mixed with the smell of sea air, and mourners wore black as if in homage to the style she had made iconic. In those final rituals, the veil passed from fabric to symbol, from garment to legend, leaving behind a story that Italy could never quite resolve. The closing montage lingers on images. Pupetta in her youth, radiant in a white dress. Pupetta in black, clutching her child at her husband's funeral. Pupetta, older, her hands trembling as she lights a cigarette on her balcony. And always, Pupetta, veiled, walking past cameras with a gaze that dared the world to judge her. Her life remains a tragedy, layered with myth, a narrative Italy cannot stop retelling, because it touches the deepest contradictions of its society: honor and crime, beauty and blood, tradition and modernity. The final echo returns us once more to 1959, to the courthouse steps, to the jostling reporters, and the air thick with cigarette smoke, to the young widow who chose vengeance over silence. The veil falls across her face, obscuring her expression, but revealing her creed. To the end, she embodied the Camorra's most dangerous code: honor above all.